If you're hearing this, then it's already far too late for you to make better choices about how your evening will go. You've clicked on a video about a medieval gravedigger's diary, and that means one of two things. Either you're deeply curious, or deeply tired. Maybe both. That's fine. Either way, I promise, you are in good, filthy hands. Let's dim the lights now. Sink into that pillow. Let the hum of your fan, or the occasional cough of your neighbor, become distant echoes. We're going back, way back to a place where the nights were long. The soup was thin, and nobody washed behind their ears, unless someone died, which, as it happened, was quite often welcome. To the hamlet of Gutter's End. You won't find it on a map. No cartographer ever bothered. The place had all the charm of a fermented boot, and less population than a pile of apples. But what Gutter's End lacked in culture, beauty, and basic hygiene, it made up for in one important category: mortality. People here died like it was a competitive sport, and where there are deaths, there are graves, and where there are graves, there are grave diggers, which is how we arrive at me.Tom. Just Tom. No titles, no surnames, no noble blood, unless you count the time my cousin fell off a hay cart and bled into the vegetable patch. I was born in a one-room hut next to the chapel, raised on oats, broth, and whatever the wind didn't blow away. My first toy was a broken pew leg. My first friend was a rat I named Jeremy. He bit me twice, and then died in my boot. My father was a gravedigger, as was his father, and his father before him, who allegedly once buried an entire troop of traveling mimes, without anyone noticing. We were the invisible backbone of the village, quiet, respectful, and always available. And so, it was no surprise that my first real job, my first duty, you might say, was digging a grave. I was 10 years old. My father woke me with a slap, not out of cruelty. That was just how you communicated urgency in Gutter's End. Words were for friars and drunks. He tossed me a shovel and a turnip. The turnip was breakfast. The shovel was destiny. Boy, he said, it's old Craddock. That was enough. Old Craddock had died 17 times by then, or so the tavern stories went. Fell from a roof, eaten by a goat, choked on a chicken bone, stared too long at the bishop's niece. But this time, apparently, he'd made it stick. It was raining. It always rained. The kind of rain that didn't fall so much as lurk cold and suspicious, like it was waiting to ruin your socks. We trudged to the churchyard, past the crooked stones and the rows of names nobody could read. Most markers had been made by drunks, with a chisel. One simply read, Marthish. Father picked a spot near the west wall. It was muddy, but not too muddy. He turned to me, his eyes like soup left too long by the fire. Start here. 3 feet for peasants, 6 for sinners, 9 for clergy. Craddock was a baker, so 4 and a bit. I hesitated. He handed me the shovel. It was taller than I was. The handle splintered, the blade warped, and it smelled vaguely of onions and despair. You dig, I supervise. That was my training. The earth was heavy. It clung to itself, like it didn't want to give up its secrets. Every shovelful was a negotiation. My arms ached. My legs trembled. The mud sucked at my boots like a hungry orphan. My father stood nearby, occasionally offering wisdom. Mind the worms. They remember faces. Watch for old bones. If it crunches, apologize. Don't whistle. It attracts widows. By midday, I'd made it halfway down. My father handed me a crust of bread and a leather flask filled with something he called digging wine. It tasted like vinegar and decisions you regret. Still, it made the cold easier to ignore. By dusk, I'd hit something. Hard, hollow. Don't stop, Father said, barely looking up. But something's there. He sighed, climbed down beside me. Together, we unearthed a small wooden box. Not a coffin too small, more like a crate. Inside, wrapped in brittle cloth, was a dog. A very old, Very dead, very stiff dog. Father, that'd be Bishop Edgar's spaniel. He had it buried here back in '63. Snuck it in, wasn't supposed to. He spat into the mud. Clergy, always bending the rules. I stared at the skeletal remains. The jaw was frozen in what looked like a smile. Its collar was still intact, the bell long rusted. What do we do? Father shrugged. Rebury it. Sideways. Pretend it's a fox. By nightfall, the grave was ready. They brought old Craddock in a wheelbarrow, wrapped in a sackcloth. One toe poked out. Someone had put a flower in his mouth. A dandelion, probably picked from the road. A few villagers gathered. Most were just there for the bread afterward. The priest said a few words. Something about dust, and returning to it. Someone sneezed. A dog barked. Craddock was lowered with all the grace of a sack of flour. Father nodded at me. Now cover. I hesitated again. He leaned close. First rule of the job, Tom. Always look busy when they're watching. After they leave, take your time. I nodded. Began to shovel dirt back over the man who once gave me sugar lumps when no one was looking, who danced at weddings, offbeat but with enthusiasm, who claimed he once kissed a noblewoman but was too drunk to remember which species she belonged to. Craddock disappeared beneath the soil, and just like that, my first grave was done. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because of ghosts. Gutter's End had those, of course, but they mostly minded their business. No, I lay awake because my arms hurt, and my legs were numb, and I couldn't stop thinking about the dog. Buried once in honor, now shifted sideways in shame. A loyal creature, stuffed between a baker and a bishop's grudge. I wondered what else lay beneath our feet. What secrets the earth kept, buried not by time, but by embarrassment. A sword from a forgotten war. A scroll no one could read. A promise someone broke and tried to hide. I fell asleep with dirt under my nails. From then on, I was the grave digger's apprentice. The job came with certain perks. People didn't make eye contact, which meant fewer conversations. You got to stand in the shade of the chapel. You were always invited to funerals, though rarely to the wakes. The dead didn't judge. The living did that plenty. And the earth was patient. Every grave I dug had a story. A child who drowned. A woman accused of witchery for growing carrots too large. A knight with no sword, no name, and a pouch of strange stones that hummed when it rained. I buried lovers, liars, singers, drunks, a man who died of laughter, and a boy who simply stopped waking up. Some graves were shallow, rushed. Others were deep, as if the family hoped distance would matter in the afterlife. And all the while, my father watched, silently, proudly, until the day he didn't. But that's for another night. Tonight. Remember this, when the world is heavy and sleep feels far away, there is comfort in knowing that somewhere, long ago, a boy named Tom stood in the rain, shovel in hand, carving a quiet place in the mud for someone who had run out of time. It wasn't glorious, it wasn't clean, but it mattered. Even now, the earth remembers, so rest now, let the dirt settle. And if you dream of old Craddock, still holding that dandelion, floating gently through the dark, will continue tomorrow. The next grave awaits. The donkey was not dead, which was surprising, because it had been buried 3 days earlier, in the old barley field behind the tithing barn, where the mud never properly dried and smelled of old fish and damp priests, I should explain. Wilfred, the donkey who was not my donkey, but belonged loosely to the vicar's son, and even more loosely to no one at all, had gone missing during a rainstorm so biblical that it made the priest smile for the first time since his wife died, and she hadn't even existed. We had assumed, naturally, that Wilfred had drowned. He was not known for his foresight, nor his swimming. nor his ability to stand upright in conditions that didn't involve dry hay and casual cruelty. So we buried him, or, more precisely, we buried what the boy found something vaguely hoof-like, sticking out of the bog, bloated and motionless, like a bad memory stuffed into a sock. 3 days later, he turned up behind the bakery, chewing on Father Elfric's spare cassock and kicking anything that moved, which is how we learned we had buried something else. No one wanted to dig it back up, and so it was decided, in a meeting of groans and weak ale, that the ground would remain untouched, the memory unspoken, and the mystery forever filed under God's mistakes. That was the same week the church bell tilted. The bell had hung in the crooked tower since before the conquest, and some said it had been gifted by a Norman baron whose head later fell off during Vespers. It swung with the voice of iron fury, and each Sunday morning it announced that you were late, dirty, sinful, and unworthy of soup. But that morning, it swung wrong. It made a sound like a drunk hiccuping into a cauldron, then tilted hard to one side and wedged itself between two beams, where it remained, stuck wheezing slightly, like it was ashamed of what it had become. This was taken, naturally, as a sign. What kind of sign, no one knew. But it was definitely one. Some said it meant a bishop was dying. Others said it foretold a season of rats. One woman claimed it meant the second coming was due on Tuesday, just before supper. Father Elfric said it meant we should all repent, then asked if anyone had extra mutton. I, of course, was told to investigate. Not the bell that was beyond my station and my interest. No, I was told to inspect the beam below it. The wood was rotting, they said. Dig beneath the bell tower, said Elfric, who smelled of lentils and was sweating far more than the weather allowed. Just a small inspection, for peace of mind. I had no peace, and little mind, but I agreed, mostly because he offered bread. The earth beneath the bell tower was different, not like graveyard soil, which is soft and damp and filled with small, sad surprises. No, this dirt was old, packed, baked by centuries of sermons, feet, sin, and pigeons. It resisted the shovel. Judith the shovel did not like it. She made a dull thunk with every strike, like she was smacking stone teeth. By the third hour, I had found only 3 rusty nails, a shoe buckle, and half a clay doll's face. It stared up at me with the frozen expression of someone who'd just heard the price of good bread. Then came the wood, dark, splintered, ancient. At first, I thought it was part of the old foundation. Then I cleared more and saw the edge and the carving. It was not a beam. It was a box, long, narrow, buried deep, with just enough rot to suggest it hadn't been seen since before the last king died. On its side were etched 2 things, a sun with eyes and a hand, holding a coin. No words, just that dot. I did not open it. Not immediately. I am not a fool. Not the dangerous kind, at least. But I sat with it, traced the lines with my fingers, listened to the silent breath of buried wood, and wondered. Elfric came that evening, swaying slightly from whatever passed for wine in the rectory cellar. He asked if I had found rot. I told him no. I had found something else. When he saw it, he said nothing. Not at first. Then he knelt beside it, placed a hand on the lid, and sighed like a man remembering the taste of peaches. "You'll forget this," he said. It wasn't a request. It was a prayer. Then he spat on the box and walked away. Naturally, I did not forget. I buried it again. Deeper then, I buried a sheep's skull on top of it. Just for confusion's sake. If they dig it up again, let them think. The sheep was rich. A few days later, the bell tower leaned another inch. The choir boys were forbidden from ringing it, lest it collapse mid-hymn and flatten them. The oldest boy, Edwin, was furious. He had a voice like a buttered trumpet, and a face that made dogs nervous. He lived for the bell, in secret. He snuck up the tower one gray morning and tried to ring it anyway. It swung once, groaned, and spat out a dead owl. The boy screamed. The owl thudded onto the floor. The bell stopped moving. They found him halfway to the next village, pants gone, hair white, muttering about the eye inside the metal. He never sang again. The other boys were thrilled. The graves that month were mostly normal. An old woman who ate soap by mistake, a man who insulted a bee hive, a boy who tried to wrestle a goat and lost, but something was off. The earth near the bell tower, it pulsed, only slightly, like something dreaming with indigestion. Once, I thought I heard whispering, not words, just the shape of breath. Judith didn't like it either. She bent slightly, her handle curving like she was trying to bow away from the hole. I told no one, not even the donkey. Some things are best whispered to worms. Then came the storm. It arrived without clouds, without wind, without rain, just thunder, loud, close, hungry. The ground shook. The church door flung itself open. The bell rang once without touch, and somewhere beneath the tower, something sighed. The next morning, the earth had cracked in the graveyard, a line of black dirt stretching from the old yew tree to the base of the tower. No one noticed, except me and the donkey. He refused to walk over it, just stood there, ears twitching, tail still, as if the air smelled of endings. That week, I was asked to dig a grave for the choir boy, not Edwin. A new one fell from the bell tower. No one knew why he'd gone up. They said it was an accident, that he'd tripped, that the bell had nudged him. I asked how a stuck bell could nudge. They told me to dig. I did. I made it deep, and cold, and silent. Sometimes I think about the box, the carving, the hand with the coin. I dream of bells that ring in reverse, of coins that spin without falling, of eyes inside wood, watching, waiting. The bell has not rung since, but at night, if you walk past the church and put your ear to the ground, you can hear it breathing, just once, every few hours, like it's dreaming of something long forgotten, or remembering something we never knew. I am Tom. I dig, I bury, I forget, but the earth remembers, and Judith does not forgive. The donkey bit the vicar yesterday. I think it knows too. The year turned again, as years tend to do, when no one is watching them carefully. I never saw them arrive those fresh New Years, but I always caught them leaving, usually around the same time. My knees began to ache harder than the stones they knelt on. Winter didn't ask for permission this time. It simply arrived, gray, damp, with breath like a priest's wine farts, sat itself across the village like an unwanted ant who smelled of nettles and regret. It was during that first frost that I noticed a strange truth. The dead rot slower. In winter, they keep, you might say, like meat wrapped in moss and forgotten behind a monastery larder. If there was one blessing to be plucked from the icy fingers of winter, it was that corpses were less eager to return to soup. The stink of a fresh grave in August could drive away even the blind flies. But in January, crisp, almost polite, I remember it vividly. Because old Tullyhour, bell ringer, with the crooked spine and permanent winds died in the middle of his daily ringing, fell face first into the bell tower rope. The clanging went on for 42 minutes before someone noticed he wasn't just enthusiastic that day. We buried him next to the goose pen, as per his will, which was scrawled on the back of an old bishop's sermon. It read, in smeared charcoal, "Put me near the birds. I like their noise. If I hear angels, I want to be sure it's not just geese." Poetic, in a way. Though the geese never forgave us. They hissed at his grave for weeks. With Tully gone, the bell duties fell to a boy named Crispin, who had a voice like wet shoes and the attention span of a cow in a thunderstorm. He'd ring for weddings during funerals and forget to ring at all 4 deaths, which rather complicated my schedule. Nothing worse than digging a grave for someone who hasn't realized they're supposed to be dead yet. I confronted him once behind the chapel, told him he needed to take death more seriously. He nodded solemnly. then asked if worms could scream. I told him yes, but only when monks weren't listening. Crispin ran away for 2 days after that. The thing no one tells you about grave digging is that it's 40% digging, 30% watching people lie to each other during eulogies, and 30% standing in the cold, wondering if this was really what God had in mind when he invented knees. I began to suspect God had a strange sense of humor. After all, he'd made turnips and plague rats and choir boys. Speaking of choir boys, the lot of them began rehearsing for Lent early that year. They would pass the graveyard at dusk, their little faces scrubbed raw by overly enthusiastic nuns, singing hymns with such piousness it made the trees feel guilty for not bowing. One of them, Marcus, once approached me mid-dig and asked, "Brother Tom, do you ever talk to the dead?" I told him I do, and they usually correct my Latin. He didn't laugh, just blinked slowly and offered me a cold piece of barley bread as if I were some sad toad that had lost its way. I took the bread. It was stale, but edible. Like most church things. That was the winter I began speaking to the bones more often. Not in madness. Just habit. You spend enough time among the quiet, and eventually you fill the silence with your own questions, or jokes, or both. One morning, as frost bit my beard and the dirt held like a miser holds coin, I was digging for a sister Elfreda who had succumbed to an accidental fasting. She fasted so hard she forgot to breathe, common among the pious. They treat air like a sin. Sometimes, as I reached the depth of her resting place, my spade hit something solid, but hollow like wood, but angrier. It was a jawbone, not hers, an old one, much older than any name in our current book of death. I held it up to the light. It grinned at me, toothless mostly, but still grinning. "Another freeloader," I muttered, tossing it gently aside, onto the pile of older relics I kept for amusement. Thigh bones, finger bones, occasionally a kneecap that had seen better centuries. The graveyards here were ancient, built atop older cemeteries that predated Latin, England, or the idea of soup. Whenever I dug deep enough, I found things. Scraps of pagan necklaces, broken iron pins, skulls that had been drilled, oddly shaped stones with symbols too tired to be evil anymore. I once found a wooden doll with 3 eyes and a smile carved sideways. Gave it to a monk as a gift. He burned it while screaming, said it whispered in his sleep. I just think he didn't like gifts. Sometimes, when you unearth too much, the past tries to say hello, and that winter, it did. One evening, well after the sun had fled behind the hills like a guilty nun, I stayed behind to finish Alfreda's grave. The wind had teeth that night, sharp ones, the kind that remembered Viking winters. As I dug, the earth grew strangely soft, like old pudding. The spade sank faster than expected, too fast, and suddenly I was waist deep in something I hadn't planned for. A cavity, an old crypt, forgotten. I felt the shift of air as if the ground had exhaled. Inside, beneath crumbled stones and rotted beams, were 2 skeletons, twined, embraced. One had what looked like a crown of bark. The other, a dagger still wedged between its ribs. Lovers, murder, accident. Maybe they both sneezed at the wrong time. I don't know. But I whispered an apology, covered them gently, and swore not to disturb that patch again. Some things were buried for a reason, and others just wanted to be left alone. Back in my hut, which leaned to one side like a pious drunkard, I scribbled the discovery into my grave diary. Yes, I had one. A habit I'd inherited from father. Pages of names, dates, oddities, and the occasional limerick about bones. It wasn't scholarly, but it kept me company. That night, as I tried to sleep, I heard the bell ring once. Just once, at an hour when no one should be ringing. I stepped outside. Crispin wasn't there. The rope swayed. I looked toward Elfrida's grave. It had snowed again, but one set of footprints led from it, and none returned. I chalked it up to bad bread, cold, sleep, or ghosts with poor manners. Either way, I rang the bell twice the next morning, once for Sister Elfreda, once for whoever or whatever had left. Some say gravediggers are haunted men. I disagree. We're just patient. The dead do most of the haunting themselves. We just keep the door open. Now, tomorrow's dig is for a tax collector. I'll be using the shallow shovel. He always did like shortcuts. Good night. They buried the blacksmith's wife upside down again. Not on purpose. No, it was just that the coffin was hastily nailed by her grieving husband, who had, in his despair, downed an entire clay jug of fermented beet gin before starting. I told him the hinges looked odd too close to the bottom, but he wouldn't listen. So now her toes point to heaven and her crown presses into the soil, like a bulb waiting to sprout back into argument. No one else noticed. Funerals are quick affairs when your village smells of rot by default. We say words, throw dirt, pretend God's not watching, and move on. Except me. I stay with them longer. I pat the mound. I lean on Judith a shovel. Not the long-dead woman and I think. You think a lot when your best conversations are with holes in the ground. The donkey, Wilfred, has taken to biting. He's old now, older than me, if such things can be measured. His eyes have filmed over with age, cloudy like the sky just before a good thunder. He bites the priest's robes whenever they flutter, and I respect him more for it. Fathers shouldn't wear lace in the wind, it invites scrutiny. Father Aldwin says Wilfred is cursed. That the donkey was once the familiar of a witch burned in Shale Hollow. That each bite is a soul tax, a nibble of the spirit. I say, he just has a toothache and a bad temper, like every other resident here. But at night, when Wilfred stands at the edge of the graves and stares down with those clouded eyes, I do wonder what he sees that I don't. They asked me once if I feared ghosts. I said, no, not really. You have to believe that dead stay in one place, to be afraid of them, but I don't. I think they go, sideways, into trees, into mud, into mushrooms that grow on the church wall. They tangle themselves into things. That's why the moss on gravestones always grows fastest on the ones who lied. The most ought you ever notice that. The smoothest stones belong to children. The most cracked belong to those who died honorably. There's a lesson there, and if you press your ear against some of the graves, just lightly, you hear things, not voices, not whispers, more like the memory of a whisper. Like something wanted to say something once, and forgot how. Sometimes I press my head there anyway. On the tomb of Goodwife Marin, who choked on an acorn pie in spring, all I hear is regret. It hums like a kettle left too long. We've a new priest. Now, not to replace Aldwin, no. Father Aldwin lives forever out of stubbornness and pickled onions, but to assist. A thin man with trembling fingers and sermons too long for their own good. He's called Brother Pembridge. Pembridge wears shoes that shine, the kind of shine you don't get from mud walking, which is to say he's a fraud. I watched him one morning try to bless a grave while holding his robes above the dew. The worms laughed, at least I think they did. They moved in a pattern that could only mean mockery. Worms are the only congregation that stay quiet during sermons. I found a toe, not attached. Mind you, just ... There about 6 inches below the left elbow of Thomason Hill's resting place. The soldier who died from smiling at the wrong man's wife. I wasn't digging there, not officially. I was trying to find the edge of the cemetery, to see if the fence truly circled us like Father Aldwin claims. I think it doesn't. I think it goes nowhere at all, and that the dead have begun to sprawl, stretch out in their sleep like cats on a hearth. So I dug, and I found a toe. Not a clean one, a feet-and bone peeking like it was embarrassed to be seen, and beside it, a worm, not like the others, pale blue, large, glowing faintly like a candle dipped in morning. I tried to catch it, it vanished. Some say hallucination, I say omen. There are dreams I keep having now. In them, I dig endlessly down, and down until the soil changes. It becomes silk, then salt, then something like glass. And when I look up, the sky is gone, and Judith the shovel's whispering things I can't write down, because they have no letters, only feelings, and every grave I open contains, ... myself. You'd think that would be alarming, but no, it's peaceful. Like recognizing a song played backwards. Old Mags came again today, alive despite the odds. She's been dying for 22 years. Each time, she arrives at my hut with a bottle of turnip, cordial, and a request to inspect her pre-dug plot. I want daisies, she croaked. No forget-me-nots. They're too clingy. Mags believes if she visits her grave enough times, she tricked death into thinking he's already taken her. She might be right. The ground seems to know her weight now when she lies down to test the size. The dirt settles like it's welcoming an old friend home. There's a silence in winter that's heavier than snow. You know the one, when the frost stiffens the ground so even the moles pause. When the bells from the chapel don't echo, but drop like stones into woolen air. When you breathe, and your breath doesn't float, it curls inward, like it's trying to return to your lungs. I dread those days, because no one dies in winter. Not officially. They freeze, they disappear, they turn still, and no one wants to bury them until thaw, so they sit with me. Not literally, but in the graveyard, in that air, in that silence. They linger, they press in. I feel them on my shoulders, in my boots, in the back of my neck, just where the shovel rests. That's when I know to talk. So I do to the stones, to the sky, to Judith, to Wilfred, who nods solemnly, chewing whatever he's found in the chapel. Trash. There is a spot near the north wall where nothing grows. Not a blade, not a root, not a worm. Even lichen avoids it. Father Aldwin says it's cursed. Brother Pembridge says it's blessed. They argue, of course, because holy men love nothing more than disagreement, wrapped in God's name. But I know what it is. It's a grave dug too deep. So deep that it touched something that isn't meant to be touched, and now the earth forgets itself there. I do not dig near it. Judith refuses. Anyway, she hums when I get close. A low metallic whine, like a song half remembered by a ghost. They say in the big city, they have professionals now. People who cart off bodies, who don't know their names, who don't pat the soil after, who don't sit by candlelight and write down what the dead murmured in dreams. They call it progress. I call it ... betrayal. The dead deserve more. They deserve someone who remembers that every body once coughed, once scratched an itch, once loved a bowl of soup so much they cried when it ran out. I know them, even the ones I never met, especially them. And when I go, when Judith lays across my chest, and Wilfred eats my final sermon, I hope someone does the same, even if all they do is whisper. He was mostly quiet, except when he wasn't, and the worms liked him. That will be enough. The moon tonight is split, like it's considering its options, half hiding, half watching. I like that. I think graves are like that too. Not quite endings, just quiet considerations. Tomorrow, I'll bury the miller's son. He drowned in barley mash. A strange way to go, but fitting. Somehow he always smelled of yeast, and sang off-key about angels in boots. I'll give him a soft grave. I'll tell the worms to be gentle, and I'll write his name where moss can't find it. You ever buried a bishop? I have. Twice, actually. First, the real one. Then a different bishop-shaped bundle that may or may not have been a pig in a hat. But I'm getting ahead of myself. It started on a Tuesday, which, if you know anything about Tuesdays in our village, is the day God looks away briefly and leaves the rest to chance. The church bell rang 10 times that morning, and none of us could agree if that meant someone died or if the bell just wanted attention. Turns out it was both. Bishop Alfric, may he rest in dampness, had collapsed face first into his barley gruel. They said it was a seizure. I said it was God's way of saying, "You've sermonized long enough." They didn't ask my opinion, but they gave me a body to bury. Bishop Alfric was a man of many smells, mostly ointments, fish, and secrets. I don't judge a man for sweating like a saint or whispering to shadows, but I do raise an eyebrow when someone dies on a Tuesday with half a letter to the Pope tucked inside their robes and the name Gertrude underlined 4 times. I took the bishop's body to the crypt under the church. It's not like the normal graves. No mud, no worms, just echo. You ever dig into silence? It fights back. Even Judith, my shovel, sounded quieter down there, like she didn't want to wake the dead. I lowered him into a stone cavity beside 3 other bishops, whose names had long since become moss, placed the silver chalice near his hand, whispered a few words, something about peace, eternity, and boiled onions, then sealed the slab with the help of Edgar the bell-ringer, who smells like pickled despair and sweats like a trout in confession. Done, we thought. Buried Finis. That night, the confessional pig came. Let me explain. There's a pig in the village, name of Beatrice. She belonged to the apothecary's widow, but she escaped after the widow tried to teach her Latin. The pig now lives behind the church, and occasionally listens in on confessions through the wall. I'm not joking. People talk. The pig grunts. Sometimes she grunts in perfect rhythm to guilt. We all agree she knows too much. So when Beatrice started squealing that night, not her usual "I've found a turnip" squeal, but a high-pitched wail that sounded like Latin for the bishop. Walks again. I knew something was wrong. I lit my lantern, took Judith, and walked back to the crypt. The slab was moved. I don't mean cracked. I don't mean disturbed. I mean moved. Shifted aside like a man who'd had a good nap and wanted a midnight stretch. But Bishop Alfric was still inside, sort of. He was ... different. His hands were crossed over his chest, but his mouth was open now. And inside no tongue. Just a rolled parchment sealed with wax. I didn't touch it. I don't touch messages from dead men's mouths. That's a rule I learned the hard way when I once pulled a worm from a magistrate's ear and heard it whisper, "My name?" I closed his mouth, whispered no thank you, put the slab back. Next morning, the bishop's steward came down, red-faced and flustered, asking if I'd seen anything strange. Define strange, I said. He didn't answer, just handed me a sack of coins and said, "We need another bishop buried." Quietly, I blinked. Another bishop. He showed me the body. Looked like Alfric, robes and all. But this one was fatter, and slightly free. It was a pig. They had dressed Beatrice in the bishop's ceremonial garments, stuffed a stole in her mouth, and were hoping no one would notice. People don't look closely at dead bishops, the steward insisted. Just bury it in the crypt. Say nothing. I looked down at Beatrice, holy in velvet and pearls, eyes still wide with whatever pig. Thoughts she hadn't confessed. I nodded. Right. That evening, I dug a second bishop's grave next to the real one. The crypt now held both truth and performance. The authentic corpse and the stand-in, like the church itself. Really. I laid the pig down gently, whispered a few lines from a sermon I vaguely remembered about humility and hay. Sealed the slab. The church rang the bell 14 times the next morning. Again, no one agreed on what it meant, but I felt it deep in my marrow. Something had shifted. When you bury a pig as a bishop, you bury more than flesh. You bury trust. And also the last of the barley stores, because Beatrice had eaten most of them before her appointment to sainthood. From that day on, things were ... quieter. The confessional booth stopped smelling like carrots. The sermons grew shorter, and no one mentioned Bishop Alfric again, until one foggy morning, a monk from Canterbury arrived with a letter sealed in wax. It was addressed to the dead, to His Grace, Bishop Alfric, resting beneath God's gaze. The monk insisted I open it at the grave. I did. Was from Gertrude. The letter was short. The secrets are safe. The pig knows nothing. You may rest. Yours in ashes and affection, G. The monk left a rose. I left Judith leaning against the crypt wall, just for a moment. And for the first time in my life, I swear I heard the stone breathe. Not groan. Not shift. Breathe. Sleep now. If you can. If the sound of snuffling hooves and whispered prayers in pig Latin doesn't keep you up. After all, in this village, saints are made from whatever's left lying around. Even mud. Even you. Even Beatrice. You awaken to the sound of church bells. Not the elegant tolls of a grand cathedral. No. These are the sort of bells that clang like old pots dropped down a stone well. They're cracked in pitch, slightly drunk in rhythm, and one of them is held together by rope, wax, and a single persistent beetle. Sundays, you remind yourself, are for sermons, sins, and sitting very still while the priest coughs into a goblet and pretends to know Latin. You dislike Sundays, not because you're irreligious. You've buried enough nuns, bishops, and pilgrims to qualify as a high priest of decomposition, but because Sundays mean public, clean villagers, soggy cloaks, whispering children, the kind of folks who suddenly remember you exist when it's time to talk about death. You rise from your sleeping pit, technically a floor mattress, but once a dog died in it, and now you call it the crypt. You live behind the chapel, in the corner that smells most like sour bread and forgotten candles. It's not glamorous, but the roof leaks only on weekdays, and the mice are very polite. You stretch. Your back makes the sound of dried twigs. You call that spinal honesty. It's a cool, gray morning. The kind of day where even the worms yawn twice before wriggling. You throw on your digging tunic, same as the weekday one, but with slightly fewer holes. For breakfast, 2 boiled turnips, one of which bites back. And then, shovel in hand, you begin your Sunday rounds. There is no grave to dig today. That's unusual. By this time of year, someone has usually tripped on a goat or eaten the wrong mold. But today, the churchyard is still. You stand beside the oldest tomb, the one with the stone angel that lost her nose in a windstorm and now looks permanently surprised. You rest your hand on the moss-covered edge, run your fingers along the carved name, which time and lichen have rewritten as here lies someone, possibly named Henry, definitely expired. Behind you, the doors of the church groan open. The villagers shuffle in. They look like a line of laundry dragged through spiritual obligation. Inside, the priest is already beginning his sermon. It's in that same half-mumbled chant he uses every week. You suspect he only knows 7 words of scripture and rotates them like old shoes. You lean against the chapel wall and listen through the stone. ... And lo, the righteous shall not stumble ... unless tempted by goat ... Classic stuff. Then you hear it, faint, just beneath your boots. A knock. You freeze. You tilt your head. Nothing. But then knock, knock, 2 soft thumps, from beneath the chapel. Now, you're not the panicking sort. You've buried folk who've woken up mid-funeral, only to apologize for the inconvenience. You've dealt with rats the size of toddlers. You once found a bishop buried with 3 knives and a pigeon, so you're not easily rattled. But still, knocks from below the church are rare. You bend down, press your ear to the stone. A 3rd knock, then silence. You blink, sigh, and say aloud, very calmly, right then, we're ignoring that for a little while. By midday, the sermon is over. The villagers spill out, blinking like overcooked owls. Some nod at you. One old woman leaves you a boiled beet. You nod respectfully, tucking the beet into your pocket like an artifact. But the knock has followed you, not physically, not in sound, but in mind. You keep seeing it, hearing it, feeling the faint reverberation. Up your calves. You know that beneath the church lies the crypt, an old stone chamber. No one's entered in decades. Locked. Forgotten. Only opened once. Years ago, when the bishop fell in. That was the day you learned that bishops bounce. You glanced toward the chapel door. Locked. But the back, you circle the church like a monk with guilt in his sandals. Behind the structure, near the root-cloaked base, there's a door, half-rotten, covered in ivy. It creaks when touched and smells like old book soup. You hesitate, then open it. The stairs down are made of black stone and unkind dreams. You descend, one careful step at a time, each footfall kicking up memories and mildew. The air is thick, wet, and smells faintly of spoiled sermons. At the bottom, a great stone arch. The door here is iron and oak, sealed tight with a rusted latch, shaped like a lion biting its own tail. You press your ear to it, silence, but as you begin to turn, knock from the other side, you do not scream, you simply whisper, absolutely not, and leave. That evening, you sit behind the chapel with a bowl of wet bread and stare at the stars. You think about the crypt, about the knock, about all the things you've buried that weren't quite ready to stay buried. You remember the man who asked to be interred upside down so he could keep watching the surface. You remember the baby with no name, wrapped in a song. You remember digging a grave for a night, only to find someone else already lying there, grinning politely. And now there's a knock. From below, you sip from your mug of boiled herbs and beet water. You contemplate the concept of boundaries, physical, spiritual, architectural. That night, you dream. In the dream, you are digging, always digging. But the soil is not soil, it's pages. Pages of sermons, pages of prayers. Every shovelful throws up verses, confessions, words that crawl across your arms like ants. In the pit, something breathes, something old, something patient. You wake with a beat in your hand. You don't remember grabbing it the next day. There is a funeral, at last. Someone has expired. Old Farley, the village wool merchant, has passed on after a heated argument with his goat. It's a simple burial, a small coffin. The priest says kind words. May Farley's soul be as fluffy as his wares. You dig, quietly, efficiently. You notice the earth feels different today. Not soft, not hard, just alert, like it's listening. The grave done, you step back, the coffin lowered, dirt returned. But as the last clod hits the surface, you feel it again. Knock, but not from below. From Farley's coffin, you sigh. You lean on your shovel. You say, Farley, if you've changed your mind, now's the time. No reply. You wait. Then you hear it. A muffled voice, very faint. Definitely. Farley, ... Is this the afterlife? You blink, then say, no, Farley. You're in the ground. Pause. Oh, silence. Then, a second voice, from beside the grave. But no one is there. A whisper, don't answer the door. And then, nothing. That night, you do not sleep. You sit in the chapel, alone, candlelight flickering, shadows moving like they're bored of your silence. You face the altar. You stare at the stone floor. And then, in pulse, you return to the crypt. This time, you carry a lantern, a rusty one. It smells like despair and pine tar. You descend, one step at a time. Again, the iron door. Again, the lion latch. Again, the knock. But this time, only once. Knock. You whisper, who's there? Silence. Then you. The voice is yours. You turn, you run. You do not return to the crypt for a week. In the days that follow, strange things happen. Birds nest in graves, frogs croak, hymns. One villager claims to have seen her dead husband waving politely from the church window. You dig 3 new graves, only to find them already half filled with dirt, but not the right kind. And every time you sleep, you dream of the knock. Of the crypt. of something waiting. One evening, the priest finds you. He looks troubled. He says he's heard whispers in the nave, seen shadows move upward, toward the ceiling. The font has turned to salt. The wine tastes like tears. The bell rang itself twice. You ask, did you check the crypt? He nods. It's empty. You blink. Empty, empty, empty. It wasn't. Before. Exactly. You spend the night in the graveyard, watching, listening. You think of all the people you've buried, all the prayers you never said, all the worms you've disturbed. The crypt is silent now, but the knock remains, in your chest, behind your eyes, like a clock ticking backward. As dawn rises, you whisper, Judith, we need to dig. You pat your shovel. The blade is cold, but eager. You pick a spot, an empty one, and begin. Because sometimes, you must bury the question to unearth the answer. I remember the morning by the stink of apple vinegar and resentment. The monks had spilled some on the church steps, trying to disinfect the blood of a sheep they'd accidentally sacrificed instead of a goat. It wasn't the first time the scriptures were misread, and it wouldn't be the last. Latin is hard. Sheep do not protest as loudly as one might hope. I was sweeping bones again. There had been a frost, and it had curled up around the edge of the cemetery like a dying cat, thin, gray, and full of secrets. My boots crunched over bones that had risen overnight, like they always did when the cold made the dirt twitch. Frost heave, they call it. I call it God's cruel way of playing dice with ankles. You never know when the toe of a friar, or the jaw of a long-forgotten mistress, will rise up to greet the dawn. And yet, there I was, poking with my shovel named Judith, whistling a hymn about fire and damnation, when something clinked against the blade. It wasn't bone, it was bell, not a full one, just a tiny rusted tongue of metal tied to a string, embedded in the soil beside a finger. I recognized the old trick, burial bells, in case someone got buried alive, which, let's be honest, happened more than once a fortnight. We didn't do it for the sake of mercy. We did it to save space. But this bell had rung freshly, my mouth dried, which was impressive, given I hadn't had water in 3 days. I licked the back of my shovel and leaned in. Who's still jingling? I muttered, and then, like a hinge, turned by breath, the soil shifted. Not a lot, just a settling. But I knew the language of graves. I'd lived among them longer than I'd lived among the living. Something below was not at rest. I dug not out of duty, not out of care, but because curiosity kills more grave diggers than plague and ale combined. The name on the crooked wooden marker was smeared, but I remembered. It was Elric Thorne, the blacksmith with the wooden eye, and 2 wives. One dead, one missing. He'd been buried 2 weeks ago, and now he was still warm, or so it felt. His coffin, such as it was, hadn't collapsed like the others. It opened like a dry-mouthed yawn, exhaling a breath of dust and mold. Elric was not where I'd left him. His body was turned, face down, arms folded behind his back. That was not how I buried him. There were scratches on the inside of the lid, fresh ones, and around his neck, a second string tied tight, as if someone had come to stop the bell from ringing again. I stood there, shovel in hand, Judith trembling in her iron silence. Behind me, the wind whispered through the iron gate, and the church bell, the big one, gave a low, uncalled chime. No hour, just one lazy note, as if it too had remembered something foul. I didn't rebury Elric. I wasn't sure I should. Instead, I placed a rock on his chest, a big one, the kind that would disagree with any resurrection plans. Then I walked to the farthest end of the graveyard, where only paupers and liars rested, and I sat on a broken headstone and ate a turnip, raw, like grief. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind wouldn't let me. It howled through the rafters, like a sermon with bad news. And then came the knock, not at my door, at my floor. Tap, 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 tap. I stared at the boards. Judith leaned against the wall, and for the first time in years, I took her to bed with me. Not in passion. In defense. By morning, the tapping stopped. But outside, muddy footprints led from the graveyard to my door, and I began to wonder if Elric Thorne had ever truly died, or if someone had planted him there, a seed meant to bloom in the wrong season. The next day, Father Cadwell came by, his hands shaking more than usual. He asked me to rebury Elric properly. Holy water, chanting more rocks. He paid in cheese and guilt. As I dug the second grave for the same man, I found something else. A letter, folded damp, and shoved in Elric's shirt, written in a hand I didn't recognize. It said, simply, "The bell is not for the dead. It is for those waiting to be." I started sleeping in the tool shed after that, closer to the church, farther from the tapping. Every night, I dreamed of soil in my mouth, of bells with no ropes, of faces I never buried, staring at me from under my bed. By the third week, the graveyard had gone quiet again, too quiet. Even the birds refused to land on the fence. The donkey, Wilfred, died that Thursday, just fell over while chewing his own tail. I buried him beside Elric. I figured they'd get along. Both of them had terrible breath and a mean left hook. But when I came back 2 nights later, the grave was empty. No Wilfred, no Hoofprints, just more footprints, small, bare, wet, leading up the church steps. I stopped telling people what I saw. They never believed me anyway. They just said, "Too much dirt in your ears, Tom, or the fumes from the leach bucket are getting to your head." Maybe they were right. Maybe I'd cracked. Or maybe the dead were just growing restless. Once read, or maybe dreamt, that the dead don't fear resurrection. They fear being forgotten. And lately, it seemed like some of them were ready to remind us. By the end of that winter, I had begun to hum to the graves. Not songs. Names. One by one. Names I remembered. Names I didn't. And as I hummed, I listened for the jingles, the rustling, the whispers underfoot, because Judith, my dear shovel, had started to vibrate on her own when near certain plots, as if guiding me, as if saying, "This one isn't finished yet." And I, Tom the digger, the lonely keeper of the soil, began to realize I may not be burying the dead anymore. I might be guarding them, somewhere beneath me. Elric's bell jingled once more. They say the ground remembers what the living forget. Not in words, of course. The ground does not write letters or argue with its siblings over inheritance. But it remembers in texture, in scent, in the way a boot sinks just slightly deeper near where a man with a guilty heart was buried on a moonless night. It remembers in the groan of wood that's been left too long beneath wet clay, in the shape of old worm tunnels that twist like the path of a drunk monk's sermon. By this point in my profession, as the only certified gravedigger within 3 parishes, I had developed an understanding with the soil. I wouldn't rush it. It wouldn't rise up to swallow me. Mutual respect, you might say, which is more than I could claim about most relationships in my life, especially with other humans. But today, the ground was jittery. It was the feast of St. Wolfbert, the slightly confused patron saint of farmers who accidentally set fire to their own fields. A minor occasion in the religious calendar, but one our village took seriously, mostly because the rector got drunk and handed out free barley porridge at dusk. Everyone would pretend to like porridge. No one did. But food that was free was also blessed, and that made it twice as good and half as edible. I, however, had not made it to the porridge line this year, because just before Vespers, a boy came, running into my graveyard with eyes wide and lips trembling like pudding during an earthquake. He didn't speak right away, just stood there, gasping like he'd forgotten how to breathe somewhere on the way. "Let me guess," I said, leaning against Judith. Someone's died. He nodded. Well then, I hope they waited until they were old and unimportant. They were, ... He swallowed. Important. Oh no, I muttered. Not one of the cloth. He shook his head. Worse. I blinked. How many pigs did he own? No. I mean worse. It's Lady Fenwin, the Baroness. She's dead. I paused. Well, I said, that's a first. You see, nobles didn't die like the rest of us. They expired in castles, surrounded by velvet and mild cheese, and were carted off to monasteries for burial by monks with hair like wreaths. They weren't meant to just up and die in the middle of a peasant's turnip row. But that's exactly what Lady Fenwin had done, according to the boy, who was now hiccuping, like his ribs had turned to goats. Where is she? I asked. The orchard, he whispered, face down, with a chicken on her head. That last part, I decided, was probably grief-induced confusion. Still, I slung my sack over my back, collected Judith, and followed the boy toward the Fenwin orchard, a stretch of brittle apple trees that mostly grew wind and disappointment. Sure enough, there she was, Lady Fenwin, a woman who once fined a family 5 pennies for smiling too loudly during a sermon. She lay motionless between 2 gnarled trunks, her pale blue gown stained with damp leaves, her hair undone. The chicken, mercifully, was just walking, nearby and not, in fact, perched on her skull. There were no signs of a wound, no blood, no frothing mouth, no expression of horror, just the soft stillness of one who had very suddenly decided they'd had quite enough of the world. I bent down. Well, I said, this complicates things. The boy had vanished, which was fair. Children are allergic to responsibilities. Lady Fenwin was what you'd call nobility adjacent. Not high enough to matter to the king, but high enough to matter to everyone else. Burials for her kind were supposed to include 30 monks, 12 roses, a stained glass confession, and at least 1 live falcon. I had Judith, and a donkey with social anxiety. Still, the dead don't wait for protocols, so I fetched my cart, loaded her with as much dignity as the creaking planks would allow, and wheeled her back to my graveyard under the cover of a fast-falling dusk. That night, I began digging under the old sycamore. It was one of the few places left that hadn't already been claimed by plague pits. Sinners, or William the smuggler, who had insisted on being buried with 40 barrels of pickled eels. No one wanted to dig near him. The smell had learned too. Speak. Judith cut the soil like butter, slow and firm. Each shovelful landed with a thud that echoed off the church walls and into my ribs. Around the 8th foot, I hit something hard, not stone, not coffin, something in between. I dropped to my knees and brushed away the dirt with the sleeves of my shirt. The shape emerged, a carved face, pale and twisted, with lips frozen in a scream and eyes wide with terror. It was a statue, a head, marble, maybe, old, very old, and buried exactly where I had chosen to place Lady Fenwin. Coincidence? Perhaps, or perhaps the ground, once again, was trying to tell me something. I looked around. Nothing stirred except my donkey, Wilfred, who was watching from the fence with the same expression he always wore. Distant loathing. I dug the rest of the night, uncovering not just the statue's head, but a partial body, shattered ribs of stone, fragments of wings, an angel, or something pretending to be one. I did not sleep that night. I watched the grave from the window of my shack, cup of boiled dirt water in hand, while the moon slithered across the sky like a dying fish by morning. The villagers had noticed that first. Came the widow Tamlin, holding a pie that may have once been food. Is it true? She asked, squinting at the grave. That depends. What do you believe? That the Baroness died with a chicken on her head. I sighed. No chicken, just bad luck. She handed me the pie. I placed it carefully next to a rock that hadn't yet offended me. It twitched once, then was still. Others followed. By noon, Half the village was gathered near the graveyard, not weeping exactly, but looking suspiciously well dressed for a bunch of dirt-eaters. She was a good lady, someone said. No, she wasn't, said another. Right, the first corrected. She was a memorable lady. By sunset, rumors had bloomed like bad mushrooms, that she had been poisoned by a rival, that she had choked on an apple blessed by a witch, that she had been cursed after eating an owl on a dare. I buried her that night, just as the church bell struck 10. No monks, no roses, just Judith, me, and the soft sigh of the wind against the yew branches. I gave her a proper stone, simple, with no words. The silence felt more honest, but that wasn't the end. 3 days later, the grave began to hum, not loud, just a faint, steady vibration, like a child whispering secrets into a jug. I placed my hand on the soil. It trembled, briefly, then stopped. I told no one. What would I say? That the noblewoman's grave was singing. Still, I watched. And over the next week, strange things began to happen. A fox was found sleeping on her stone, eyes wide open, frozen in place. It didn't blink. It didn't move. It just sat there until someone touched it. Then it crumbled into ash. A flock of black birds landed on the yew above her, then dropped dead in perfect unison. The rector came to pray over the grave. He vomited for 6 hours and forgot his own name. We now call him Jeff. He used to be Bernard. I dug the grave up again on the 7th night. She was still there, pale, untouched, eyes open, and she was smiling. Not the grin of a saint, not the relief of someone finally at peace, but the faint, knowing curl of someone who had won a game you didn't know you were playing. I closed the lid, reburied her, and added an extra layer of soil, then another, then a third. I placed a stone cross upside down just in case, and still, the ground hummed. Not a song, not a voice, but a memory. A warning. Lady Fenwin had died in the orchard, but she had not left it. Whatever walked back to my graveyard had not been her, and I had buried it under the old sycamore, where the statue with wings had waited for something, for someone, for her. I now sleep with Judith beside my bed, not because I fear the living, not because I fear the dead, but because I no longer trust the ground. It remembers too much, and sometimes it whispers back. The bishop died. Finally, we all had our bets. My coin was on the fish bones. Jory bet plague, Elfric said, divine smiting, but no, it was his own slippers what got him. Tripped on his rug while reading from Revelations, cracked his old skull on a candlestick, and slid face first into his fire grate. Burned beard, boiled nose, and a scorch mark on the stone floor, like the silhouette of a chicken trying to scream. He was 83, and mean as vinegar. A bishop, yes, but the kind of holy man who taxed the graveyard by the square foot, and made me pay in both coin and turnips to bury my own aunt. Rest her lumpy soul. I always said I'd dig him the narrowest grave I could get away, with shoulders pinched, feet cramped, like a coffin-shaped insult. But now, standing there with my shoveled Judith, ash still wafting from his singed robes, I almost felt warm toward him. He'd made it this far in a town that devoured priests like buttered eels. That was worth something, I thought. I measured the spot under the yew tree, where the ground was soft from last week's rain and 3 centuries of monk's blood. He'd wanted to be buried by the nave, but I figured God's ears reached trees better than stones, and besides, I didn't like him. By now, I'd buried so many that graves weren't holes to me anymore. They were slum, dim rooms, where secrets went to hum in the soil. I could read the dirt like a drunk reads tea leaves. Clay meant silence, chalk whispered, sand grumbled, and loam, oh, loam giggled, always giggled. The bishop's grave giggled. I dug, and the earth gave up fragments, bits of bone, a copper ring, what might have been a tooth, and might have been a baked bean from the convent's pantry explosion last summer. Judith struck something hard, flat, wooden. I pried it up, and lo, beneath was an old plank, rotted at the edges, heavy with wet time, a forgotten coffin lid. This wasn't the first double-decker burial I'd found, nor would it be the last. When space is tight and death is fat, the dead get cozy. I once found 3 monks spooning like boiled sausages in one grave. Another time, I found a knight and a pig, both wearing chainmail. Don't ask. I opened the lid. A woman, or the idea of one. Just bones and lace, but the kind of lace only highborns wore. And on her skull, wrapped in damp silk, a crown of sea glass and dog teeth. Not a relic, not a saint, a wife. I sat down on the grave's edge and scratched my beard. See, the bishop wasn't just a man of God, he was a man of wives. 7 that we knew of. 4 buried. 1 ran off with the mason. 1 became a nun, sort of, and 1 still haunted the vestry. We called her Singing Maud. No one ever saw her, but come moonless nights, the nave would fill with the sound of humming, low, slow, and sad, like someone remembering a lullaby while choking. I'd once followed the sound down into the crypt, only to find nothing but shadows and the scent of lavender over mold. Singing Maud had outlived the bishop's flesh. Some said she'd been buried alive. Others said he'd stuffed her under the altar like a forgotten hymn book. Looking at the lady in this grave, I had a strange feeling that the bishop had buried Maud more than once. When I lowered the bishop's coffin into the giggling ground, I did it slow. He deserved that, if only because his ashes still smelled faintly of rosemary, and I'd stolen his boots from my cousin Wulfric's wedding. Once he was settled, I filled the grave with soft scoops, covering him inch by inch. I said nothing. Prayers are for those who need forgiving. The bishop, I think, already knew what hell had waiting for him, and probably looked forward to arguing with it. I carved a marker with my dullest knife. No name, just a circle, a worm, and a small pair of feet. He'd understand. That night, I dreamed of the singing. It was closer now, no longer drifting from the nave or the crypt. No, it came from beneath my own bed, a deep-throated hum, slow and patient, like someone was waiting, or rising. I lit a candle and peered under. Just Beatles, and Judith, resting like an old soldier. Still, I didn't sleep again. I just stared at the wall and listened as the earth shifted beneath me. Because once, you see, I buried a woman I loved, and she never stopped singing. The next day, a letter arrived. A letter, in our town, was like a comet, or a miracle, or a chicken that lays soup. We didn't get letters. We got warnings, proclamations, or torn scraps of messages tied to rats. But this was a proper letter, sealed in wax, smelling of old wine and richer Latin than I'd heard in years. It came from the abbess of Fenwick by Mere, a place I knew only by curse and legend. She wanted me, Tom, the gravedigger, to come bury someone very important, someone sacred. She called it the Singing One. I left before dawn, Judith strapped to my back like a relic. The road to Fenwick was crooked, lined with trees that leaned in like gossiping crones. Fog clung to my ankles, and the wind hummed, always in the same tune, for notes, repeated endlessly, as if the land was remembering a melody it once buried. At Fenwick the abbey was all teeth and shadow, black stone, wet with age, gargoyles that dripped, and nuns with eyes like locked doors. They led me to the crypt without speaking. There, lying on a slab of salt and ash, was the corpse, and I knew her. Maud, older now, more bones than woman, but the crown was the same, sea glass and dog teeth. Her jaw still hung slightly open, as if not, and her eyes, yes, still open too, looked straight through me. The abbess said she'd been singing for 3 nights straight. No breath, no lungs, just sound, the kind that made milk curdle and candles weep, and now they wanted her buried. properly. The catch: she must not be buried in consecrated ground. No church, no graveyard, no blessing. She was never meant for heaven, the abbess whispered. She knows too much of the earth. I carried her myself through fen and field, bog and brush, until my boots rotted and my knees forgot how to pray. Judith helped me dig deeper than I'd ever dared. So deep the soil stopped laughing and began to hum, matching her song. When I placed her in the hole, her crown fell off. I left it behind, covered her with dirt, inch by inch, and when I finished, I pressed my ear to the grave. Silence. No more singing, just the faint sigh of soil. Content now, back in my village. I sleep better, a little. The bishop no longer scratches from below. The choir boys stopped screaming during matins, and the moon feels less watched. But some nights, when Judith leans against the wall just so, I hear her hum. Low, 4 notes, soft as a worm's kiss, and I hum back. Because I know, someday soon, it'll be my grave someone else digs. My own singing hole, and I only hope they use a proper shovel, one with a name. They say every hole must close, even the ones you dig yourself. The shovel my Judith leans against the wall now, rust-kissed, wooden spine warped from half a century of lifting the dead. She waits. Not for me anymore, just waits. That's all. Things do, in the end. I sit on a small stool, the one missing a leg, beside the hearth that hasn't seen flames since the summer. My knees began muttering secrets to me in the dark. The walls of my hovel sigh with the wind, each timber soaked through with the scent of dirt, mildew, and unsaid prayers. It is winter again, or maybe autumn pretending. I haven't dug a grave in 43 days. I counted the first 19, scratched each day into the wood of my table, until the knife blade dulled and I couldn't tell one groove from the next. Then I stopped. Not because I forgot, but because I knew remembering was just another way of clinging to a version of myself that no longer put spade to earth. The last man I buried was not really a man, at least not by then. More of a collection of regrets wrapped in skin, died in the chapel aisle, slumped like spilled porridge across the stone. The vicar said no rites. He owed the church. As though you could owe anything once you've left your teeth behind. I gave him the same as I gave everyone, dirt and quiet. I whispered into the hole before covering him, told him not to worry, that it wasn't so bad down there, that the worms were kind if you were polite, and the roots only tickled if you didn't fuss. He didn't respond. Most don't, but I always pretend they do. The town has changed. We have new bells now, brass ones, imported from somewhere across the sea, where people apparently wear hats made of glass and eat bread that doesn't taste like disappointment. The bishop says the bells sing to God. To me, they sound like hollow boasts, like an old man coughing through a hymn he doesn't believe in. Children no longer run from me. That's how I knew the end was near. They used to fear the gravedigger, whispered that I had no soul, that I slept with bones and heard voices from beneath the soil. Now they offer me apples, worm-bitten soft, but apples nonetheless. They sit beside me sometimes, ask questions I don't answer. Is it scary down there? Do they move? Can you hear the dead talking? And I just nod, because once you've heard them, you can't explain it. And once you stop hearing them, you start wondering if you've gone deaf or if they've simply moved on without you. I dream of graves now, not nightmares, not ghastly things, just dreams of tidy rectangles, dirt, soft and yielding, the hush of dusk. My hands, young again, driving Judith into the ground, the smell of soil rich like roasted barley, no faces, no mourners, just the earth and me. A communion, older than scripture. I never married, unless you count the job. Judith and I, a union sanctified by sweat and silence. The only vow I ever kept was to finish the hole I started. And I've started my last dot last week. I marked a patch behind my cottage. Not too far, not too close. Beneath the bent elm tree that leans like it's tired of holding up its own shadow, I dug it slowly, bit by bit, a ladle of earth, each morning, careful not to strain the back that carried 600 souls before me. The dirt was stubborn, clayless, and rude, but I whispered to it, the way I always did, "Easy now, it's for me." Took me 8 days. On the 9th, I laid inside it, not to die, not then, just to feel the shape of it. It fit, like a coat I'd always meant to wear. Tonight the wind's heavier, the sky is muttering. The sort of night when witches boil clouds and the moon hides out of fear she'll be blamed. I lie on my cat, thin blanket, thinner breath. Judith is beside me. I brought her in from the cold, cleaned her for the first time in years, wiped the blade, kissed the handle, told her she was a good tool. I think she knew. Tools no more than they let on. There is no pain now, only slowing down like a candle choking on its own wax. I smell earth, even with my eyes closed. Hear the soft footsteps of worms pacing there. Daily sermons, they'll welcome me. I left them plenty of friends, and now, my part in the story ends. Not with fireworks, not with land lamentation. Such just a slow breath, a closed eye, and a heart folding in on itself like a letter never sent. So if you ever wander past an old elm tree, bent like it's whispering to the grass, and see a grave with no name, no, that's me. Still listening, still waiting. And if you listen closely, beneath the hush of worms and roots and memory, you might hear a rusted shovel sigh as the last grave closes. Good night.